Hi, all, welcome. Gonna wait a couple minutes while Zoom lets everybody into the virtual space. Okay, numbers are trickling down a little bit. Welcome again. Okay. Yeah, I think it's slowing down a little bit. Let's go ahead and get started. So, welcome. Yeah, thanks already for jumping in on the chat. I want to definitely encourage folks to contribute, share your ideas, and also ask questions in the chat. Taylor and I will make appointed efforts to save some time for questions at the end, and we'll try to sort of earmark the ones that we think we can dedicate some time to. If you aren't already aware, we're talking in detail about reinforcement systems as they apply to school implementation for kids with selective mutism. And I'm Caitlin Reed. I'm a SM specialist. I'm at Thriving Minds, which is in Michigan. I'm the current president of SMA, board of directors, and I have a fantastic colleague and co-speaker today.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So happy you are here. Thanks for sharing a slice of your day with us. My name is Dr. Taylor Hicks-Hosty. I am also a therapist, child psychologist at Thriving Minds here in Michigan, a colleague of Caitlin's, and I'm also a nationally certified school psychologist. So I've spent a number of years feet on the ground in schools and have loved every minute of it.
We have a couple of very quick announcements, and then we have a lot of content to cover, so these will be very fast. As I mentioned earlier, please feel free to use the chat and put your questions in there. So this webinar is being recorded. We'll eventually post it to YouTube, but folks also have the ability to get continuing education for this. And if you haven't already done so, there is still an opportunity to go back and through the registration page, go back and add that to your plan. And if you have any difficulty with that, Kristen will probably pop her email in the chat so you can follow up with her if you have any trouble. And then she's also going to add a few of the sort of upcoming and important events that SMA has, one of which is we just came off of our conference season. We have a limited bundle of videos that are available of the talks that were live in person in Chicago. We have a fantastic web course for educators, and we know that there's educators on this call, so we wanted to make sure we call out that in particular. And there's a parent support group coming up too. So I think that Kristen's going to pop all of that in the chat. And without further ado, we're going to jump into the content. Okay, so very briefly, a couple of acknowledgements and disclosures. As our other webinars, our webinar today has been made possible by a grant that we received from the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation. So we're incredibly grateful to them for supporting our mission in getting more information about evidence-based practices out. Briefly about disclosures, Taylor and I both shared that we're on the SMA Board of Directors, and I'm a co-author on a book that pertains to this topic. So I wanted to share that. We're not going to go into detail about the learning objectives because you can read and because this is available elsewhere, but obviously we're talking all things reinforcement today and specifically how to get into the thick of implementation of it. And we're going to start first with why. And so there's I guess a couple of lenses. Firstly, we want to talk about selective mutism treatment and what does a typical intervention package include, and where and how does reinforcement systems fit into that? And then we're going to talk next about what are our sort of best frameworks and guidelines about school implementation and service plans, and then we're going to marry those things together. So from the SM treatment perspective, most of the research that has been done has been focused on behaviorally based interventions, so behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapies, BT and CBT, if you will. They're the most widely used by folks with expertise in the field, and of course, they have been well researched for SM, but also other anxiety conditions, social anxiety, separation anxiety, the things that have a high degree of comorbidity with selective mutism. And there's a couple of sort of key things we would want to share about framework that might be relevant for you to know. So we're first sharing about you see the antecedent behavior consequence here on your screen, where we talk about something happens environmentally that sort of sets the stage for or is the trigger for a behavior, right? So that's the antecedent and then the behavior itself. And then finally, the consequence portion, whether what we or the environment does either reinforces, makes the behavior more likely to continue or to occur again in the future, or it punishes and therefore makes it less likely to occur again in the future. And then that sort of creates a cyclical pattern where now the individual has an increased likelihood of demonstrating X, Y, or Z behavior. So right now, for individuals with SM, the behavior is lack of communication, sitting in silence, frozen, right? Engaging in those types of behaviors. And the consequences that many times we end up moving on because it's awkward, because we're uncomfortable, because we've been sitting in silence, because we're seeing a child struggle. And so we are inadvertently reinforcing lack of communication. And of course, with our reinforcement systems, we want to sort of flip that consequence to reinforcing a step in the right direction, a tiny step outside of the child's comfort zone. Reinforce bravery effectively instead of avoidance. And from the cognitive behavior lens, you can see that we sort of know behavior and thoughts and emotions are all interlinked. I'm not going to spend much time on that because we're not discussing the cognitive side, but just as a point of reference for especially our older students and clients with selective mutism, that the cognitive component can come into play as well. All right, so we have some great meta-analyses at this point. So a meta-analysis, if you're not already familiar, is a study of a bunch of studies. So what we're looking at here are studies that include primarily randomized controlled trials. So kids were randomly assigned to receive a treatment or a wait list or a non-treatment condition, and then we can compare and contrast how the symptoms sort of fall or the anxiety markers or the verbal communication looks post the treatment window for the two groups. So the meta-analysis then takes all of those participants and sort of squashes them into one bigger assessment. So we have this great meta-analysis that suggests behavioral interventions are highly effective, especially when we're comparing them to these no treatment or these waitlist treatment goals, and specifically that we see an increase in speech output. We also see changes with regard to general anxiety, and we see overall improvements in well-being. And the reason this is so important is because reinforcement is an integral component of this. And I wanted to highlight a couple of these studies specifically that fit under or in that meta-analysis because they are specifically relevant for our conversations today. The Orbeck study here was carried out directly in a school setting. They use reinforcement. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit there. And what we saw is that 5 years following the treatment that they received, we really saw substantial gains that were made and maintained for many years after, including a number of the participants who were in full remission, did not have evidence of selective mutism anymore. The second study that's referenced here, Cornacchio, they replicated a school via an intensive camp. And similarly, we saw immediate gains right away. And we also saw ongoing progress after the intervention had concluded and as the family and the school and the kids themselves continued to implement the strategies post-treatment. So we wanted to share a bit about what does behavioral treatment look like, what's subsumed under this. Of course, our focus today is on reinforcement, but we know there's a lot of ingredients in a typical intervention package. So that includes things like role playing, right? Priming, helping the individual to be prepared, and we might model some of these skills and interventions for them. We might be using goal setting, where we help them to identify what is a reasonable goal and target that goal and practice and implement it. You probably have heard of stimulus fading and exposure, where we sort of incrementally increase the communication demands. You'll see this particular chart here shows how many treatment studies incorporate these intervention approaches. And of course, we see at the very bottom that almost all of these sort of gold standard intervention studies include contingency management for selective mutism. And if you're not familiar, contingency management is just another word that we use, of course, to be confusing to describe reinforcing behaviors that we want to continue to see. So this is a huge component of what's been out there in the research, and we really wanted to stress how we might use that. This chart also shows us what are some of each of those randomized controlled trials that I referenced a bit ago, and what was included in each of those treatment packages. And again, we're seeing that almost everything that has been done from a research perspective includes some component of contingency management, reinforcement, or reward. You'll see the other components as well. I just wanted to comment really quickly that the Esposito study here, it's written in a different language, so it's a little harder for us to sort of parse apart what are some of the components at play here. So you'll notice we didn't mark any of those there. And this came from a prior webinar from our SMA.
Wonderful. So now kind of transitioning to put kind of our school hat on and then kind of focus on this multi-tiered system of support, which many of you might be familiar with, especially if you are kind of within the education field and if your school, your classroom are implementing components of it. I'll give kind of this brief overview for individuals who it might be a less familiar term, one of the many acronyms we in education and psychology use. But essentially, multi-tiered systems of support, or for short, MTSS, is this concept of a tiered framework that systems, such as a school system, use to identify and address student needs, whether they be academic needs, behavioral needs, social emotional needs. And there's this really nice continuum of practices or intervention strategies across all three tiers at the class and the school level. So kind of that initial tier, what are kind of universal strategies that we are using to support students across those domains. For students who are at risk or starting to demonstrate skill deficits in those domains, they might then fall in that yellow tier based on the data that your school is using. And that might indicate that we need to offer some targeted support to help prompt, teach, and reinforce that targeted skill. And then at the highest level, where there's a highest level of need, that's why it's at the top of the triangle, theoretically, fewer students are falling in that higher level of need category. That's when we bolster up our resources and support of them across, again, these three domains of how do we prevent or set the student up for success in that targeted domain? How do we teach or prompt for the specific skill that we're trying to get them to use more frequently, consistently, or more appropriately within their environment? And then how are we responding to either their use of it or their lack of use of it? So who is using MTSS? The Every Student Succeeds Act that was signed into law back in 2017 or 15 provides general support for a tiered system. Again, this isn't like a detailed play-by-play book. There's not a manual that schools have to implement, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. But it's more, again, this framework. So there's this flexibility along this system of support for students. It's gained great traction. Again, this is very much supporting work smarter, not harder. Allocate your resources efficiently and succinctly to best support your student body, as well as the staff supporting your students. And recent research, kind of survey research, suggests that there is an uptick in the adoption and implementation of MTSS in school. So starting kind of at 55% back at 2019 data, and then growing to that 74% in the most kind of recent data point from this article in 2023. Again, I want to acknowledge, though, that doesn't always equate to full, comprehensive, all the wrinkles are ironed out within the system. This more speaks to we're in the process. A lot of times school adopt this framework through the lens of more academic before shifting and focusing on how do we do this for our behavioral and social emotional supports for students. So then jumping into the social emotional behavioral supports, a recommendation or a key core feature of MTSS through this lens kind of highlights these four key points. First, we want to prevent challenges by setting students up for success. We want to teach those critical skills, lagging skills or underdeveloped skills. We want to respond in ways that encourage student use and growth of that skill. And then over time, we're using data to monitor growth and adjust supports accordingly. So zeroing in on ways to respond that encourage skills and reduce challenges, that is things such as using recognition systems to provide that frequent and clear feedback and reinforcement of student use of the skill, such as those token economies, point systems, use of rewards, offering students to cash in on whatever their choices, their preferred item, to really celebrate their growth over time. So then how does this fit in with the services and supports that schools are offering our students with SM based on the limited research we have on it, where some of our more knowledge, Caitlin, you can probably speak to this too, is more us just consulting with schools on the daily basis and seeing what's working versus what's not. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that, yeah, so we know that the research supports the use of behavioral intervention, including reinforcement with individuals with SM. And the school sort of guidelines and framework via MTSS suggests that we could be using this type of support. And is this actually happening? Is, I think, the next logical question. And do you want to jump ahead?
Yep. So the most recent research we have, there's a couple different slides and I'll kind of go through them briefly, but if you want to take a deeper dive, this is a really interesting study by Beneth Pang et al. In 2023. It was data from 2019 to 2020 via online parent questionnaires, sample about 230, asking what type of support is your child with SM receiving at school? So you can see the breakdown in that first graph. About 60% were receiving some type of accommodation or intervention. And those types of supports were captured across either IEP plans, 504 plans, or more informal personalized type plans, maybe captured more through within that MTSS framework, like a student support plan that wasn't tied to that legal guiding framework or document. So you can kind of see the breakdown there that students are receiving some type of support, but then let's take a deeper dive to see what exact type of support that is or what that looks like. So they were asked, what do interventions look like for your child in the school setting? The highest rating they received was about 40% students were receiving speech services, about 22 receiving in-school counseling, and then some other things that were noted included like PT, OT, play-based therapy. Now, these researchers then asked specifically about some of those strategies Caitlin highlighted that are supported and recommended based on research we have about behaviorally based treatments for individuals with SM. So then looking at this graph, and remember, in an ideal world, we would be at 100% that we're using a lot of these components. The highest was 16.3% reported they were doing some level of exposures or brave work in the school setting. Next highest was stimulus fading strategy. But But what I don't see on here at all is kind of that reinforcement component that we know works, and we know that through an MTSS framework that staff are familiar with and potentially then equipped really nicely to adopt and implement for these students. So the research supports, hey, this works for our students. We have a framework that we think would lay a really clear path for staff to do this, but there's still this gap. So we're going to address a little bit about why before jumping into the how-to. The how-to is super important. I know that's what brought you here today. But even if we know how to do it, if we aren't fully aware, talking about the barriers that might be getting in our way, and we still then might trip up in terms of our implementation.
Okay, so one of the most common, right? I'm a clinic-based professional. I've never been in a school. So when I'm collaborating, one of the most common sort of points of feedback that I hear is that we shouldn't have to bribe this person to talk, right? There's sort of a misconception about the difference between reinforcement systems and bribery. So I've given you some illustrations of what these sort of bribes might look like and what people might be envisioning when we share that. But we know that there are clear distinctions between the two. So in my mind, bribes are acts of desperation where the goal is to stop a negative behavior, negative here. All right, so I'm envisioning a kid you're trying to get through the grocery shopping and your kid is screaming and crying in the checkout line because they want a piece of candy and you're embarrassed. And so you end up desperately buying the candy because you just want them to be quiet, right? And that would be an instance of trying to stop this negative or undesirable behavior. And you can also see where this would be implemented in a really inconsistent or variable way. Sometimes at the grocery store, I'm in a rush and I just have to get out and I might be sort of have less bandwidth to tolerate my discomfort about my kid's tantrum. Whereas other times, I have some more time, or there's less people around, or there's other parents nearby who can give me a little bit more flexibility and grace. And so it's not often implemented incredibly consistently. Reinforcement systems or reward systems, by contrast, are very planful and strategic. We have specific goals that we're targeting. We have a specific way of tracking the progress towards that goal, and we have a specific way of changing or reducing the supports over time so that our goals shift or that we reinforce less frequently, right? So it is a very planful system and it's implemented in a much more consistent way. Of course, the priority too is reinforcing a positive behavior. So we're saying instead of, well, I'm not going to throw it instead of, we're saying, hey, this kid is making steps towards being outside of their comfort zone. They're working on making sounds or talking to somebody new in a one-to-one situation, or they're verbalizing in the context of a small group lesson. Whatever the goal is, we want to be able to reinforce the behaviors that are consistent with those goals. And as I previously mentioned, we do assume with reinforcement systems that reinforcement is already at work. We are actively reinforcing avoidance for many individuals with SM right now. They avoid, we feel anxious, the speech expectation goes away. And so we really just need to flip the switch so that we are reinforcing that more desirable behavior instead, and helping them to be outside of their comfort zone and grow. So I'm gonna let you, for time's sake, I'm gonna skip this, but just as a few examples that you can go back to and re-reference. We'll share our slides, and certainly again they'll be available on YouTube. But if you can pause at some other point and go through and sort of envision what you think, whether these are reinforcements or bribes, and think a little bit about how that might be implemented.
I think I'll just add one
Oh, okay.
reminder to you all that when we are in fight, flight, or freeze mode, when our anxiety is triggered, I'll speak for myself. You could offer me the
Yeah.
world, and I'm not doing it because it is that terrifying. Where as opposed to in a reward system, right? If we're taking really small steps towards a goal and I'm being reinforced along the way, I'm more likely to make growth.
Yeah, so it's the combination of the exposure, right? These sort of small steps plus the reinforcement, and the two have to go hand in hand. We can't just reinforce. I know there was a great question in the chat about like this. I have a student who's like blatantly freezing. I don't have anything to reinforce, right? So the two have to work together. Okay, so another theoretical concern that schools, parents voice is that we don't want to sort of squash someone's internal motivation to speak. And this sort of sets up intrinsic internal motivation as a contrast to external motivation, that these are sort of separate entities and work in very distinct ways, right? So someone has a personal, drive or motivation. I want to have deeper friendships. I want to be able to talk to my friends, right? So this is my internal motivation to being brave, and this sort of external, the promise of X reward, that's artificial, and it's going to sort of dismiss or put down the intrinsic motivations. And we don't believe that to be the case. I'm going to highlight a couple of components here. One is that, and I always throw myself here, I am incredibly intrinsically and internally motivated to do what I do. I love seeing kids be brave. I love collaborating with schools and families, and I love seeing people make progress. And I also wouldn't work blatantly for free either, right? All the time, certainly. So the same thing is true for us as is for our kids. We are asking them to face their worst fears in a slow and incremental way, but face their worst fears nonetheless. And often the sort of promise of the reward at the end, it can help the individual offset some of their hesitance and their strong discomfort at the beginning, because they know there's something super desirable in it for them. And we know that intrinsic motivation isn't for everyone, right? We're often working with fairly young children with selective mutism. It's commonly first identified in those early school years, in which case they might not have a ton of great insight into their sort of internal drive and motivations to keep working hard. And there's certainly others who are older, but don't have the sort of developmental framework or cognitive skills to be able to implement some of that as well. The other point that I like to make is that if we believed internal motivation alone to be sufficient, many of our kids with SM would have talked from day one. They don't want to be singled out or to feel as though they have a bunch of attention for them for not being able to speak. They have the desire to speak with their friends and to contribute their ideas to lessons. So if internal motivation alone was sufficient, most would have already be speaking. I grabbed a couple of quotes from an interesting paper that I was reviewing in preparation for this. So this discusses dysfunction in intrinsic motivation represents an important transdiagnostic facet of psychiatric symptoms, which is often classified as distinct psychological constructs, meaning that lack of intrinsic motivation is really common in the mental health field, right? Depending on the anxiety or depressive or whatever condition. And what we know specifically about selective mutism is that compounding effect of avoidance means that many with SM find other ways to get by without needing to speak whatsoever. And so I have a number of sort of tween and teen clients that I work with who'll say like, well, I can write in school and I don't need to talk there, or I don't have to have this goal. So many of the intrinsic motivators sort of lessen over time for some of the older kids. We also know that these extrinsic reinforcement plans elicit a lot of brain activity in the amygdala. And we know that the amygdala is one of our key players at a brain and physiological level surrounding anxiety and mood management, and that's especially true in individuals who report lower intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation isn't the solution for all or even some of our individuals with SM, and there's no reason why we can't put them together. Right. So we are often warring these two against each other, that the activity itself is its own outcome. So I'm playing with a friend and I'm having a great time being able to talk. And so that's the reinforcement or the reward for me. And our extrinsic motivators there's something else that we're introducing as a result of the activity. And there's some belief that there's this undermining effect, but we really don't actually see that playing out in the literature. So we want to be able to marry the two together, right? That initially we might be using and relying more on those extrinsic motivators to get over that preliminary boost of getting into the thick of this, and then be able to eventually shift to more of those intrinsic motivators over time. And we also want to be able to blend the two. So being able to use the praise that we might be using from a behavioral perspective to also highlight someone's motivation. So I gave an example here. I love seeing your smile when you played that game with your classmate. It seems like it felt really nice to open up with her, and I noticed she had a big smile too. Also, look, you earned so many points on your tally counter, right? So we can use both of those things simultaneously. And then the other piece that I just like to also recognize is that the intrinsic motivation component, you can see where there's a pretty high degree of verbalization required to really discuss that in detail with somebody, and that might be a little trickier with somebody with SM. So we might be really relying on those more trusted communication partners to help us to sort of dig into what might be beneficial to them. What do they see communication or increasing their verbal output improving in their lives? And then finally, there's some concerns surrounding implementation. Do we have everybody who's a part of the team on the same page? All of the educators and the caregivers, and if there's a clinic-based provider like myself, are we all in agreement on this system and how we're actually executing it? Right? Can we agree that it should be done? What types of rewards would be appropriate or feasible across different settings? How much do those things cost? Are they more privileges instead of just tangibles? And then, of course, the specifics of implementation, who's tracking, who's implementing, that as well. One of the other points of feedback that I'll sometimes get when I'm collaborating with schools in particular is the concern that all the other kids are going to want stickers for talking as well, because stickers are desirable in some age groups, right, or points, and that might be challenging for educators to navigate and to manage, where all these kids are unhappy that they also aren't getting the things. And sometimes that's why we have to really dig into that our goals are different for different kids, and that what one kid might be earning for doing to earn stickers might be different from somebody else. And then finally, the last component, we know that SM is very similar to social anxiety. And in fact, many individuals with SM, up to 70%, actually also experience social anxiety. So one of the things we definitely want to be careful about is how can we use reinforcement effectively without calling a bunch of unintended and unwanted attention to the child, right? We're not going to be like, hey, you earned this point in your class. So fantastic, right? I'm so proud of you for answering this question. And then have all the students turn and stare. Somebody once told me that a teacher stopped class and threw a party for their student with selective mutism who spoke in the class for the first time. And unsurprisingly, if you have a child with selective mutism or you're the teacher of a student with selective mutism, you can probably see where that backfired, and that child never again spoke in that classroom because they did not want all of that attention. So there's a concern about how are we implementing this effectively over time.
Awesome. So kind of highlighting those barriers, we started to touch on how to get around them or build paths forward in order to support our students. But we're going to talk a little bit more specifically kind of through this who, what, when, where, why, and how framework. So jumping in, first and foremost, before you can start reinforcing anything, you need to be really specific about the goal area that you're going to reinforce or target. You might have many goals for your student with SM in terms of their social skills and their verbal skills, but we know that we can't tackle them all at once. That is going to feel overwhelming for your student, as well as overwhelming for you. Then that might set you as their educator up for failure because you're juggling a lot. And then it's going to be hard to notice and consistently reinforce all those different goal area skills. So we really encourage school teams along with caregivers and the student as much as they're able to participate in this process given their level of insight and age, to be informants and developers of kind of the goals and what we're going to be focusing on now. So we know schools love data. I love data. We want to collect data to help inform these goals. We want input perspectives from the student, again, if and how they're able, the teachers and other educational staff that they interact with throughout the day, caregivers, families, of course. Many schools use a school-wide screener, social emotional behavioral screeners, which can yield some valuable data as well. I will say a lot of times those screeners offer like summary scores, like a student might exceed a cutoff in a certain domain, like anxiety or behavior concerns. And those summary scores don't always nicely capture the specific behaviors you're seeing in your student as they relate to selective mutism. So sometimes what's more effective in terms of goal development is doing an item analysis, looking specifically at what items were flagged on the screener being used. As well as using something like a school talking map, which is really a simple table. It has individuals that the student comes into frequent contact with throughout their school day on the vertical part, and then horizontally off across the top, it lists the different settings in which the student is navigating throughout their school day. So think of classroom, cafeteria, main office, playground, study hall. And then it can be as simple as going through and checking for this communication part or across these settings. How is a student doing? Are we verbal? Are we not verbal? Are we using full sentences? Are we speaking but very, very quietly? So you can start gather data that then you have captured really nicely visually as well. And then that can be easy to zone in on goal areas. On one on the table here, I have different goal areas that you might consider. This is some suggestions, but of course doesn't capture everything. But considering types of speech your student is using, are they responding versus are they working on initiation skills? How long or short are their sentences to others? What does their volume look like? How are they using things like social niceties? How are they doing engaging in those more performance-based activities or navigating really tricky social situations with their peers and relying on some of those kind of social pragmatic skills? So again, goal options, and you might be reading that list and thinking like, yes, I want to work with my student on all of those, and I have data to support the need to work on all of them. So then where do we start? So in terms of then scaffolding yourself and prioritizing goals, you might consider some of these questions. What is the functional impact of the goal or the skill area? If the student has a hard time establishing speech with substitute teachers, but current classroom teacher is very rarely absent, that might be a lower goal at this time in comparison to their teacher is expected to go on maternity or paternity leave soon. So we really need to start focusing on that skill and put it up near the front. We also want to take into account student interest and motivation. Someone had a really good question in the chat on that. Of course, we want to be reinforcing in ways that align with the student interests, as well as targeting things that feel most already naturally reinforcing to them. So let's say all of their special teachers feel really tricky right now in terms of communicating with. We might not tackle them all at once. We might start with the student's favorite subject. So we might start there and really work on that staff member before tackling the other ones. You want to consider upcoming classroom activities. So if you know the upcoming science unit is really heavy on partner and group work, but next semester, not so much, maybe then that's a goal area you work on right now. And then, of course, you have to make sure you have the resources to tackle and support implementation of interventions and brave practices in these areas. So available staff and resources at that time. Now, once you've kind of zeroed in on a couple different goals, we really encourage using the SMART goal framework, which many of you might be familiar with. It's frequently talked about in schools, but we want our goals to be really specific, easily measured, achievable, meaning that they're kind of just outside the student's comfort zone, not 50 miles outside of the comfort zone. We want them to be really relevant and meaningful for the student at this point in their school year, and time-based. We want to make sure that it's not, well, we'll get there by the time they graduate. We want to be really mindful of the progress that's being made over time. So you'll see on the side examples of how we might phrase a SMART goal, being really specific about during what activity and what the verbal expectations are for the student, not only so staff know what they're looking for and what to reinforce, but then also so the student knows what criteria they're working on in order to kind of get their payoff for putting in the really hard work. Moving on to who, we need to identify who is going to help facilitate the practice. Our go-to, we often think of classroom teachers, right, who spend so much time with your student throughout the day. And I think that's great, but I also know that classroom teachers are sometimes in charge of upwards of 30 students throughout the school day. So it's going to be really, really hard in some instances to focus on specific brave goals with them, as well as to kind of implement any type of kind of reward-based system. So we kind of encourage classroom teachers to take more of the lead on building an exposure or brave practices within the context of the daily schedule and curriculum. So things that they're already doing throughout their day, kind of small areas they can target to focus on a specific goal and then reinforcement, such as, you know, every single day you take attendance and ask students if they are a hot or cold lunch choice. And you know that's an area of difficulty for your students. So you know in your head, you're going to really focus in on that portion of the school day to support your student and provide that reinforcement. Now we know that we're likely going to need to support in order to provide the student the sufficient instruction and practice and reinforcement they need. So that's when we recommend tagging in a key worker, or I like to think of it as team captain on the school team. This is really anyone who has the available time, who is a good fit personality wise for your student, and is really interested and motivated in learning some of these skills to use and support your student. And this person is able to provide intervention more flexibly. They might pull your student out to target specific goals and practice in the context of their office or throughout the school building. Additionally, they might push into the classroom during a certain activity so they can be that student's brave coach during a science lesson or during oral presentations. And they can then help kind of coordinate and communicate across all stakeholders. So that's kind of division of labor, if you will. Again, work smarter, not harder, for our very, very busy tech school staff. We want to consider when the student will practice. A colleague of ours, I think I first heard this term from Dr. Steve Kurtz, and then many others use it too in the field, but this idea of an exposure lifestyle. We want to look at our schedule, our day-to-day life, and identify things that are already going to set us up to practice and be really good practice opportunities, as opposed to this pressure of, I need to add something else on. Educators on this call, I know that every minute, every second of your school day is packed, so much so that sometimes you don't even have a chance to go to the restroom. So adding something on does not seem feasible, right? So instead, look at what is already happening during your week and pick tasks that feel more doable for you. Now, I say that with the acknowledgement of that there are going to be times where we have to get creative and work on tasks that might not be in your schedule. So let's say your student is really wanting to work on class presentations, but within your curriculum, you really only have one slotted for the entire year. In that instance, we're going to need to get creative in how to offer that student more frequent practice opportunities to target and practice that skill. We will say it's really helpful to establish a specific, consistent time each day and each week, either built in that classroom teacher is doing throughout their day, or a time where that assigned key worker is pushing in or pulling out for support. It helps kind of establish that consistency of routine and normed expectation of working on being brave and strengthening that skill is just another really important part of our work here at school. And it also helps ensure that um, we don't accidentally lose track of time and get to something like December and not have tackled any brave goals at all. Again, because everyone is pulled into a million different directions, totally understandable. But if we have some consistency built in, we're more likely and better able to implement it. We also want to consider where the student's going to practice. So what settings you want to target first, and or which settings are accessible. We also really want to be mindful, knowing that a student might be working on a goal in the context of just a one-on-one exchange versus they are ready to work on this verbal skill in the context of a larger group setting, like in the cafeteria. Now, for school-based practices and reinforcement, we really want to be making sure that we are really good pivoters. You can think you have something beautiful set up in terms of a practice, and then things will go awry because school places are busy and sometimes unpredictable. So you want to go in with kind of a soft plan B through Z, if you will, in case something doesn't go as planned. So an easy example is, let's say your student is working on placing their own lunch order in the cafeteria. So you've prepped the student, you've done a lot of practice, you've identified the good reward that they'll get for completing the practice, and you pull them 5 minutes early so you can go interact with the cafeteria staff in a more one-on-one setting. The student, to your surprise and to their surprise, has a lot more difficulty than either of you predicted. And the practice is taking a much longer time, so much so that they haven't completed the practice by the time the rest of the student body is filtering into the cafeteria. And then you are stuck, right? You want to make sure the child is fed and have their lunch. You also don't want to abandon the brave practice and accidentally reinforce the avoidance. So that is a scenario of you want to be thinking about, what do I do in case I need more time to practice? Is there a different flexible space? Or how do we return to this practice so the student has the opportunity to get the payoff identified? Additionally, in terms of how the practice will be implemented, we want to make sure that we have a really good tracking system. This can be individualized to your student, or it can fit in the context of a whole class system that you're already using, like something like Class Dojo, right? So these are different examples of different goal tracking sheets, something that seems a little bit more like a monitoring tool versus something that feels a bit more like elementary and fun, right? Like we're going to color, put a sticker on every dot in this jar that's filled. I've also had students who like love these little craft puff balls, and we fill up the jar till they get to their goal levels. Additional example of tracking systems, I had people use golf counters, apps on their phone, or what I like to call the virtual stickers. Pull out your notes app and have them pick an emoji, and that's how you're tracking their brave work over time. Things like bravery bingo sheets. You can read more about that on the SMA website. And then we want to consider how, finally, the reason we are meeting today, right? How are we going to reinforce the skill once our goal tracking sheet denotes that we've met our goal? One quick thing about goal tracking sheets. Some of the examples I highlighted felt more elementary. I want to acknowledge that. For our secondary students, totally validate that we're going to probably need to be more low-key or covert in how we are kind of tracking student progress towards goals, pushing back more on them that they're going to keep track of their goal throughout their day, and or you are doing so in a way such as, even just making discrete check marks on a sticky note during class discussion that sits at your desk that feels really private.
I had a middle school student have like a punch card that he just sort of kept in his planner. And at the end of every lesson, if he answered a question, the teacher would punch his punch card. It was very simple and covert.
Yep, awesome. So then we need to reinforce once we're meeting our goal. So we want to be offering that specific verbal praise and acknowledgement. Thank you so much for sharing. I loved your idea. Thanks for telling me that you wanted pizza for lunch. Hey, that's a really great hypothesis. Thanks for sharing with the class. So reflecting what they said as an exposure step. I heard you, and I'm going to amplify it. Thank you for sharing, and then awarding whatever type of brave point system you have set up with your student that they can then later exchange for their reward. Consider the timing and type of reinforcement based on student age and preference. We know that in some cases, especially trickier goals or at the outset of this work, reinforcement might need to come fairly quickly, that immediate reinforcement. And other times, especially for our older students, they can tolerate a bit better that delayed reinforcement where they won't get it right away, but it will come at a later time and they're okay with that. So again, this ideal response of we're going to reflect what they shared with us, deliver that subtle praise that can be verbal or it can be nonverbal for our youth who the verbal praise would be a huge turnoff, and then paired with some type of token.
Okay, so we wanted to share, and there's a fantastic question that I want to make sure we have some time to address too about like some examples of goals, but we wanted to also give you some examples of what this might look like. And of course, you can see that there's a huge variability and a lot of options here. So we wanted to give you some of our favorites. We have a lot of kids who earn Brave Bucks. As I referenced this punch card example, oh, look at Taylor's got them ready to go. One of my favorites, if we have younger kids who sort of need a more visually clear and concise thing, we sort of cut up a laminated picture of something that they really enjoy or that they're earning, and we create little puzzle pieces, if you will, and they earn one piece at a time until they've earned the full item. So there's a ton of variations as what can make sense for you and your students. Here's some examples of what your sort of tracking system might look like. Yeah. No, and I was just going to call attention to that. You see that the goals here are written in, right? So in this example on the right, that the student answers the teacher's forced choice question, an either or sort of question, right? Would you rather have lunch A or lunch B? Or you're bringing your lunch from home today, that they answer a teacher's open-ended question, which might be a little bit more challenging, that they answer their teacher in their small group, not just in more of a one-to-one or private interaction. And this particular one on the right, I meant this to be as simple as it could possibly be, that a teacher could just go through and say, yes, I saw that 2 or 3 times today. And check that off on the side, or by a weekly basis. And on the left-hand side, you can sort of see there's a lot more boxes for a more like immediate tracking of like they did this 6 times today versus a more incidental basis. I always like to have you might have seen there's a bonus, did something awesome that was unexpected, it wasn't planned or prompted, but we like to have that too. So we like to reinforce things that happen that are tremendous that we didn't plan for. And then of course, the types of rewards can also vary substantially. So maybe it's tangible things, maybe it's the opportunity or privilege to play a particular game. Maybe it's recognition at home via a gift card. Maybe my son, this is less of a reinforcement that we've used recently, but when he was a little bit younger, he really liked to earn bubble baths. And it was a very simple thing, no extra money involved, but he was thrilled about it. So reinforcement the specific rewards can vary quite a bit. For older kids, we tend to do a little bit more in the way of privileges. Okay, there's a great question I'm going to address very quickly. So question is surrounding, do we reinforce nonverbal communication or only surrounding speaking? And this one's super tricky, and I think it's highly case specific, but in general, we try not to reinforce and encourage the nonverbals if we have the option to work on speaking in a different capacity. So for instance, I'm not going to call on a kid with SM in front of their whole class and expect them to speak on day one of this intervention approach, right? Now, on the other hand, if I have them alone in their office or in an office setting with the school social worker, let's say, I might have a much different capacity to prompt and encourage the talking. And so there, I'm going to try to prioritize reinforcing in the settings that the child can actually meet that goal, and then later work on the group presentations and talking in front of other people. So this also gets, I think, a little bit to the question that we have about generally what is a progression of talking goals, right? So if I have the option to get somebody speaking in some capacity in the school, that's the best starting spot. So that might mean that they're working on talking with their parent after school hours when nobody else is in the building. And if we can get them talking in the building, then maybe we can start working on other variables a little bit later. If we can get them talking to their parent in the social worker's office, then maybe we're able to start building up from there, that they can have the social worker join in via that fading in strategy that we've hinted at and is discussed in more detail in other presentations. If we can do that, we can get them verbal with their social worker. Well, maybe we then bring in the speech pathologist, or we generalize that into a different environment, including their primary classroom, where they're speaking to just their social worker alone in the primary classroom. And then maybe we fade that teacher in. So we're only trying to change one variable at a time. And then we're going to be reinforcing that. So yeah, that is a huge component, is having a goal that the child can actually achieve, instead of just these sort of lofty goals and saying, I'm going to promise you a trip to Disney World if you can do this. That's not, they have to be realistic and consistent with one another. Okay, and here's some fun creativity that we've, so I have a couple of clients who have earned pets for their brave work. Kudos to their parents. That's not something that I have the bandwidth to do. This is a photo some years back where I allowed a client to pie me in the face for achieving, this was a middle school age student who we had a tricky time finding something that would be reinforcing and motivating for them, but they were thrilled at the idea of making me feel a little bit discomfort. So they pied me in the face. And Taylor has a little video too of another funny one. She got to be, her client got to throw a water balloon at her. So, a little personal embarrassment for us can go a long way. At Five Below, I just picked up another like pie in the face, like one of the more randomized ones where you click the thing and you don't know when it's going to happen. This particular student brought in a whole hefty pie and shoved it on me. Okay, and so yeah, here's what we're talking about. The challenge level of the goal has to match the reinforcement value. And if it's not working in that way, we're going to have a really difficult time actually increasing speaking. So some of these trajectory of goals, right? We often prioritize these one-to-one interactions first. There's less eyes, there's less ears, there's less possibility of judgment or risk of saying something wrong in front of a lot of other people. So most people with SM find that it's easier to talk in a one-to-one interaction first. And then we're often working on small group interactions. And maybe we have a little feedback loop here where the student is doing some after school outings or play dates or get-togethers for older kids with the students who are going to be in their assigned group, right? And so we're sort of have a little bit of a feedback loop happening here where we practice some one-to-one things and then we roll those people into a group. And then every so often we can add in another new peer for that small group. And then eventually, once we're talking with most of the kids in these small group interactions, then maybe we can start working on larger group interactions. You'll notice that greetings, social niceties, assertiveness, asking for help, as much as those are so important for us, and often the things that we think of as like, those are socially expected, that's easy to introduce, those are some of the more challenging goals that many individuals with SM find, because those are the things that they've really specifically avoided speaking and would require them to like get someone's attention, stand up for themselves, say something that's uncomfortable, or acknowledge that they don't understand a lesson or have a question. So those tend to be a little bit more vulnerable and challenging for many. Yeah.
Before jumping into this, I know a ton of good questions are coming through the chat. I want to guide some of you towards the SMA YouTube page because I think some of our previous webinars that are published on there might address some of these questions since we won't have time to dedicate to that. So check out that resource for sure, as well as the SMA Educators Toolkit
And the web
PDF
course
that you can download. Yes, and the web course. Okay, so how do we change or fade reinforcement over time? So as we're making progress towards our goal, we really want to be sensitive to adjusting the level of support or the level of reinforcement we're offering. If we're making progress, then of course we can adjust the goal to better fit where the student's at. Like Caitlin had just said, moving towards a different type of verbal expectation, single word responses to full sentences, moving from responding to initiating, working on some of those nonverbal features such as eye contact when we're talking with others. We can also change the schedule of reinforcement. So at the outset of this work, or for a goal that's particularly challenging, you might need a 1-to-1 ratio of I need to reinforce every single instance of this brave speaking behavior. And then move to reinforcing after a set number of responses. So reinforcement schedule can be adjusted as well as we make progress towards our goals. And then we can also change the payoff criteria. So we have to put in more work and more practice in order to get the payoff. So at the beginning of the work with the student or at the beginning of the new goal, they might be having to earn 5 points in order to get their identified reward. Whereas once they've made progress on that and it's becoming easier, we might switch to, you need to do this 15 times now before getting the payoff. Again, noting that just because we've reduced or thinned our level of reinforcement over time doesn't mean that we won't need to up it again or increase reinforcement again if we're struggling or if a student is during a transitional period. So I like to think of if we're moving buildings even, going from elementary to middle school, knowing that we might need to increase our level or rate or type of reinforcement to aid that transition, it support them in that way. And again, kind of going back to conversation that was in the chat about this idea of how do I tap into intrinsic reinforcement? It seems like they don't have any. So again, a lot of the research, I think, from my experience, having worked in education, I feel like a lot of the conversation I've heard and research I read felt very dichotomous, extrinsic versus intrinsic, where we know that some veins or theories of research, such as Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory, look at extrinsic versus intrinsic more on this continuum, where we're using extrinsic motivators to serve as a springboard to launch towards intrinsic motivation. And we springboard towards it once we become more competent in the skill and we become more autonomous in the skill. So all of this practice is trying to increase those two things, autonomy and competency. And once we've grown in those areas, we are then more likely to be on this other end of the spectrum, tapping into our intrinsic motivation. And even think about what this might mean for our students' self-talk. Something that feels really, really tricky at the outset. It might sound like, wow, talking to my teacher feels really hard. I'm not sure I can do it. But that extra recess sounds really, really cool. So my brain is now focused on the payoff and I'm better able to push through the hard thing. Whereas
I've had kids overtly articulate that to me.
Yeah.
The chickens example, that particular student said to me, I thought about not answering, and then I remembered the chickens, and I really wanted the chickens. So I was able to squeak out a response.
Where then, of course, over time, our hope and what I think theory and research and our real life practice or as experience tells us is that once we become more competent and confident in those skills, we're naturally going to shift in our self-talk to something like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to tell my teacher what I did at recess, because that feels socially motivating. Oh, and that's it. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I know we were right up to the end of the time. We did our very best to try to address as much as we could via the chat. We thank you so much for being so engaged and thoughtful in your questions. Here is our contact information. If you do have follow-up, please reach out.
Can I answer this one last question that came in for those people? If you have to go, I understand. This is a fantastic question. So do we find that the focus on speaking and rewards may actually create more avoidance? Shouldn't we be focusing first on increasing comfort in social situations and less on speaking? So I'm going to argue no. And here's why. Because there's this idea, and I know that there's some discomfort with the language, so I apologize in advance, but the idea of contamination, that the longer an individual goes not speaking or talking in a particular environment, the harder it becomes for them to start talking to that person or in that environment, right? There's an established social norm. People know me as a kid who doesn't talk. Or for an adult, right? Like I've lived in my house for 7, 8 years. I cannot in good social graces go over and introduce myself to a neighbor who I see almost daily and say, it's really nice to meet you. I'm Caitlin. That's not, the dynamic is established. We cannot engage in that sort of a shift, right? So what we don't want to do is let a kid just sit silently and build up this expectation that I don't talk. People never heard me talk. It's going to start being really weird or scary. People are going to make a huge deal about hearing me talk. So no, I would argue no, we don't want to just get them more comfortable in the school setting. What we want to do is find a goal that they can do. And again, that might be involving one particular adult, or maybe it doesn't involve any adults from the school just yet. Maybe they can work on practicing talking with a best friend at home, and the family can be reinforcing that. And then we can work on transitioning that into the school. So there should be an entry point based on what the kid sort of is already showing some signs of being able to do. So that was an important point, and I wanted to end on that note if I could. Okay, and yes, please contact us. Obviously, we're really passionate about this, and we're happy to continue this dialogue offline. So please feel free to reach back out if you have additional questions. I'm going to hang on the line for a couple more minutes, Taylor, unless, yeah, if you need to go too. People are commenting. Thank you for your great comments. Someone put in the question, so some kids have started talking, and some of the classmates are now saying, why didn't you talk before? How come you can talk now? I often have the adults in the room offer some subtle redirection in those moments, right? It's so great that so-and-so is talking. I totally get it. We're going to try really hard not to make a big deal about it, right? She's always been able to talk, and everybody has different things that we're working on here at school, and let's leave it alone. Right. Many kids with SM report, Taylor, I don't know if this is your experience or just mine, but I have so many kids tell me that their worst fear about talking now at school after sitting in silence there for so long is that people are going to make a big deal about hearing them talk. So that's the most commonly endorsed one I hear.
I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Fantastic. Yeah, we were trying to skim through questions as we went along. PDF reference, did you reference a PDF, Taylor? I was trying to answer something else. I didn't catch that directly. Somebody referenced it.
I'm not sure that the educator's toolkit would be a PDF that's downloadable. And again, I wasn't able to throw it in the chat. You guys might have heard my background noise at some point because I was using another screen to try to find a webinar for you guys, but I couldn't put the link because I'm sharing my Zoom screen. But again, go to the website for additional webinars that I think would be useful in addressing these. And again, definitely, if you haven't already, the Educator's Toolkit is a very good start. And we also have the Companion Caregivers Toolkit, which would be great for sharing your families. I know there was a question in the chat, and how do we partner with families, which I think is essential in this process.
Yeah, and there's a comment too that is we should wrap up because of the CE requirements and guidelines. So just also to be clear, although Taylor and I are happy to stay for a couple of minutes, this is by no means a requirement. You can feel free to leave. Kristen, I'm going to lean to you. Do we have to like cut it down for CE, or can we hang on and just stop the recording?
I would say just a few more minutes and then
Okay.
have to cut off, unfortunately.
Okay. Nope, that's okay. That's
Okay.
totally fair. Do we speak to classmates on how to respond when the student with SM does talk in class? Yeah, I think that that's a fantastic question. I think it depends on the kid and what their comfort level is, right? Like how much attention they might want on them. I think something that I do think is sort of reasonable to say if the kid is okay with it, is to acknowledge like we all have different things that we're working on, and we don't necessarily want or need a big hoopla about it when we accomplish something. So that's a good question. I'll often liken it to other anxieties too, right? Many people feel worried about test taking, and many people feel worried about XYZ in the school setting, and everyone is a little bit different there. How long does it take a teen to begin to speak? Again, I think we're talking about different, talking in front of the whole class versus talking alone in a private office setting. I think those are very different situations. And like, will they talk to somebody else in our setting? Yeah.
Again, some really good questions. I think Kristen put in the chat too about the parent support group, which either you on this webinar might like to attend, or you might know a caregiver or parent that could be a good resource for. So scroll back up to the top of the chat before we close so you can see that link.
Okay, we'll call it. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today and for contributing and your fantastic questions and your dedication to your students with SM. We really, really, really commend you and appreciate you. Have a good rest of your day.